Leading your team to a Super Bowl is a feat that some of the greatest players in NFL history can claim. To be a contributing member of a team that wins one of the most coveted championships in American sports is a dream that most players have as young rookies when they enter the league. Even just being on a Super Bowl winning roster can be seen as an accomplishment on its own too. We can debate the value of certain players' championships all day, but Super Bowl champion being on your resume still has a nice ring to it. And there are certain notable players, whether once great, infamously bad, or somewhere in between, that ended up on a championship roster where you're just kind of like, oh shit, they did win a Super Bowl. My name is Caleb, and happy Super Bowl week. Another NFL season has flown by, and here we are at the end of the road with the rematch of Super Bowl 57 just 2 years later. And every year around this time, I always really get into Super Bowl history. It's one of my favorite days of the year and the culmination of every Sunday for the past 6 months, and it seems like every time I go back and look at certain Super Bowl winning rosters, there's at least one notable player that you just kind of forget were on that team. So today, I just wanted to make a fun video and go through a handful of notable players that snuck their way on the Super Bowl winning rosters that football fans remember for other reasons but may have forgotten that there is a Super Bowl on their resume. Make sure to like and subscribe for more videos like this, and with that being said, let's jump in. Actually, before we jump into these players, I want to cross into basketball just super quick, but stay with me. While Tracy McGrady ended up retiring without a championship, he was just a mere seconds away from being able to call himself an NBA champion. But he has been on record saying a championship would have been nice, but he wouldn't have been super satisfied if he had won it at that stage in his career. At that point, he was in his last season, had dealt with a ton of injuries, and wasn't contributing to the team outside of being a veteran presence. But I mentioned this to say that the value of a championship is very subjective, especially from a player standpoint. And getting back to the topic of this video, I'm always curious on how certain Super Bowls are viewed, especially former All-Pros who will most likely be in the Hall of Fame at some point. So let's start with LeSean McCoy. Not only does Shady McCoy win 2 Super Bowls in his last 2 years in the league, but he is one of the only players ever to be on a Super Bowl winning roster after beating his former team who won the Super Bowl the year before. After he put together his Hall of Fame career during his time in Philly and Buffalo, he'd find himself reunited with Andy Reid in Kansas City in what turned out to be the perfect timing for his first career ring. The AFC favorites saw McCoy in a backup role where he appeared in 13 games and rushed for just under 500 yards and 4 touchdowns. And though he'd only appear in 1 playoff game that year, the Chiefs would go on to win their first of 3 Super Bowls in 5 years, with McCoy adding a ring to his resume. After moving on from Kansas City, he'd find himself in Tampa Bay with newly signed Tom Brady, but unlike Tom, Shady's best days were behind him. He was buried on the depth chart and had the least productive year of his career, but seemingly made the right decision in the 2020 offseason, as he would get his second Super Bowl championship, with the Bucs going on to beat his former team later that February. Being on a Tom Brady-led team gave you a better chance than most to win a ring, and that was the case for one of the biggest what-if careers in the recent NFL history. Josh Gordon being able to do what he did in the 1 full season he was actually on the field gave us a glimpse of what he could have been. A 1,600-yard, 9-touchdown season in 2013 that included 2 back-to-back 200-yard receiving games and ended in a first-team All-Pro selection was unfortunately the only year we'd see that type of production from Gordon. He was obviously infamous for his off-the-field issues during that time, but in 2018 it looked like he may have been on his way back after getting traded to the Patriots, who were very desperate for receiver help. Gordon in 11 games that year had 40 catches for 740 yards, but would step away from the team late that year for mental health reasons, and then was again suspended by the league for the substance abuse policy, ending his season. The 2018 Pats would go on to win the Super Bowl that year in a defensive slugfest against the Rams, meaning Josh Gordon could call himself a Super Bowl champion despite not playing since December of that season. An unreal wide receiver talent whose career didn't necessarily pan out. We've also seen the other side of things. Whereas Gordon wasn't traditionally drafted and had off-the-field issues, there have also been some fairly high, infamous draft busts who originally had a franchise to lead but would find themselves winning Super Bowls as career backups. Just like 2-time Super Bowl champion Blaine Gabbert, one of if not the only players to say that they were a top 10 pick, won 2 Super Bowls, and went on to back up Tom Brady and Patrick Mahomes, winning with both. It's so interesting to see former top prospects who didn't necessarily work out with the team that drafted them have the team stay in essentially the same place while they go on to win championships. it's gotta be weird seeing that as a fan of those teams. And one of his predecessors in Jacksonville even has a ring on his resume. Granted, it came near the end of his career. And I don't mean to pick on the Jags this entire video, we can save that for the regular season, but Mark Brunell was a 3-time Pro Bowler throughout his time in Jacksonville, and even after declining in age in Washington and finding himself in New Orleans as Drew Brees' backup, he can call himself a Super Bowl champion with the 2009 Saints. And then there are other times where you can truly root for players who may have won Super Bowls while not contributing a ton to them to start their career, and then they go on to have very good careers in other places. Let's stay in Jacksonville for a bit, because even in my Colts fandom and dislike of the Jags, I do have to admit that Jimmy Smith is one of the more underrated receivers of the last 30 years or so. In 10 years with the Jags, he was a 5-time Pro Bowler and 2-time All-Pro selection, and forgotten to a lot of football fans, a 2-time Super Bowl champion. Obviously, those rings didn't come in Duval County, but he was a member of the early 90s Cowboys dynasty after they drafted him in the 2nd round in 1992 out of Jackson State. And while he didn't register a single reception during his 2 years in Dallas, he would see time as a special teamer and start his career with 2 Super Bowl rings. Jimmy Smith is one of those players where you can argue for his Hall of Fame case every season, and while there's still a chance he gets into the Hall one day, going from special teamer to All-Pro at a skill position is something that I can always appreciate. Something similar can be said for Priest Holmes, who, until I was doing some research for this video, completely forgot was on the 2000 Super Bowl champion Ravens. Coming undrafted out of Texas, he spent time in Baltimore as Jamal Lewis's backup and even had 588 yards on the ground the year they'd win the franchise's first chip. But as you know, Baltimore wouldn't be the city that Holmes would make himself a household name in, and he signed with Kansas City immediately after winning the Super Bowl, on a cheap contract which he followed up by leading the league in rushing and winning Offensive Player of the Year his first season as a full-time starter. He'd go on to make 3 Pro Bowls, 3 first-team All-Pros, and lead the league in rushing touchdowns twice before injuries derailed his career as he got a little older. He was one of the best running backs of the early 2000s, and with that ring on his resume, I have no doubt he could have been a Hall of Famer with a bit more longevity. I want to talk about another running back, this one who had one of the most infamous moments in the history of the NFL, and look away Browns fans, but I feel like he needed to be mentioned here in this video, but Ernest Byner is most known for his fumble in the 1987 AFC Championship game near the goal line that would have tied the game late in the 4th to potentially get to overtime and send the Browns to their first and only Super Bowl appearance in franchise history. The fumble, as it's known now, is arguably one of the most heartbreaking plays in the history of sports, and though the Browns have yet to reach a Super Bowl themselves, the man who lost the ball in the first place would not only make the game, but win one just a couple years later in Washington. Maybe one of the more underrated redemption stories in the NFL, Byner went on to be a 2-time Pro Bowler and a 2nd-team All-Pro selection after being traded from the Browns just a mere month after his infamous fumble. His 1991 Super Bowl season saw him rush for over 1,000 yards and 5 touchdowns, being one of the main contributors to that team. And to add even a little more salt to the wound, his Cleveland Browns teammate and starting quarterback of those solid late 80s Browns teams, Bernie Kosar, would also go on to win a Super Bowl himself as Troy Aikman's backup with the Cowboys in 1993. So many known and notable backup quarterbacks end up with championships where you either know them as serviceable starters at best or as fan favorite players, and you can forget that these players even have rings in the first place. I always forget Jacoby Brissett won a Super Bowl as QB3 before going on to be a serviceable starter, journeyman backup, and a fan favorite pretty much everywhere he's been for the next decade. And even Jimmy Garoppolo has those 2 rings as Brady's backup, but I think him being on the Patriots is a bit more memorable because he was originally supposed to be Brady's successor, and even he would go on to be a starter on an NFC Championship team. There's so many more players we could talk about that either snuck their way onto a Super Bowl roster or notable players that we just kind of forgot even won one. But it's always fun going back and looking at Super Bowl winning rosters just as a fan and historian of the league, and remembering certain players for whatever reason that got to add a ring on their career resumes. I thought this would be a fun video to make before the Super Bowl this Sunday and to put a bow on the 2024 season, so let me know in the comments a player who you forgot won a Super Bowl at some point in their career. My name is Caleb. If you want to support the channel, please like and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one.